Celestina Greaves had spent 40 years as the perfect wife, graceful, generous, and quietly mysterious. Harland Greaves, her devoted husband, never questioned the gaps in her past or the stories that didn't quite add up. But when FBI agents stormed their peaceful home in Ashridge Hollow one rainy morning, Harland realized he hadn't just been married to a stranger. He had been sleeping beside one of the most elusive fugitives in international history. Harland Greaves had spent his entire life crafting the perfect routine. Every morning began with a cup of black coffee, brewed precisely at 6:15 a.m., followed by a brisk walk around the neighborhood with his German shepherd, Amos. For nearly 4 decades, his wife, Celestina, had been his anchor. She was graceful, intelligent, and moved through life with an air of quiet confidence that made her beloved by everyone who met her. To the neighbors in the small town of Ashridge Hollow, they were a picture-perfect couple, the kind people pointed to and said, "That's what love should look like." Harland believed it too, until everything changed. Their marriage had been solid, even by old-fashioned standards. They rarely fought, never spent a night apart unless absolutely necessary, and shared everything, or so Harland thought. Celestina had been a museum curator before retiring a few years back. She had an appreciation for art and history that often left Harland in awe. Their home was filled with antique paintings, old maps, and vintage furniture. She had a habit of speaking in brief but wise phrases, never over-explaining herself. Harland admired that. He never once imagined there could be anything more behind her composed silence. Over the years, there had been small things, little oddities that Harland chose to ignore. Like how she always used a prepaid phone for international calls, saying it was cheaper, or how she insisted on paying for certain household items in cash. He thought it was just her way of holding on to the past. Then there was the basement, which Celestina called her archive room. It was locked with a code, only she knew. Harland never questioned it. She claimed it was where she stored old museum documents and fragile items that needed careful preservation. He never felt the need to invade her space. Despite their closeness, Celestina never liked having her photo taken. She always avoided the camera at family gatherings, preferring to be the one behind the lens. In their wedding album, there were only a few blurry pictures of her, something Harland used to joke about, never realizing it was by design. Even more curious, she never talked much about her past. Harland knew she'd grown up in upstate New York, but there were no visits to her hometown, no relatives, no old friends, calling or writing letters. She had always said that her family had all passed on. Harland accepted that. He never pressed for more. Their life was peaceful. They traveled, hosted dinners, and spent their retirement working on small projects. Harland taught part-time at the community college. Celestina volunteered at the library and the local art center. Their evenings were filled with reading, jazz music, and the occasional crossword puzzle battle. Harland cherished every moment. He believed he knew his wife better than anyone else ever could. But the truth was, he had no idea who she really was. It started on a Wednesday morning. Rain tapped gently on the windows, and Harland was in the middle of trimming his rose bushes when 2 unmarked black SUVs pulled into their driveway. 3 people stepped out, 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in dark suits. Harland, ever the polite host, wiped his hands on a towel and walked to meet them. The woman introduced herself as Agent Lyra Montrose from the FBI. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held something Harland couldn't quite name, something like warning. She handed him a sealed document. It was a federal search warrant. They were investigating someone named Celestina Archer. Harland stared at the name. It didn't register. He said they must have the wrong house. But the agents didn't hesitate. They moved past him and began searching the home. Celestina wasn't there. She had gone to the farmer's market, as she did every Wednesday morning. Harland stood frozen as strangers tore through drawers, lifted floorboards, and eventually moved toward the locked basement. That was when Agent Montrose asked him the question that would unravel everything he thought he knew. Do you know what's inside that safe downstairs? Harland's world shifted in that moment. His throat tightened. He said no. And for the first time in 40 years, he realized he didn't know his wife at all. By the time Celestina returned from the farmer's market, the FBI had already seized the contents of the basement. She parked the car casually in the driveway, holding a bag of fresh vegetables in one hand and a bouquet of dahlias in the other. Harland watched her through the window, his chest tight with confusion and dread. She seemed calm, unaware of what waited inside. When she stepped through the door and saw the agents moving through their home, her face didn't crumple in shock or confusion. Instead, it froze in a composed, unreadable expression. She placed the flowers gently on the hallway table and asked if they had a warrant. Agent Lyra Montrose simply nodded. The agents asked her to sit. They had questions. Harland sat across from her, too stunned to speak. He watched as they unfolded documents and began listing off names he'd never heard before. They called her Celestina Archer, said she had been missing since 1984, and that she was wanted for questioning in connection to an unsolved theft and a suspicious death. Harland looked at his wife's face for answers, but she gave none. Her gaze was steady, her hands still. She didn't deny the name. She didn't protest the accusations. She simply asked for a glass of water. The FBI explained they had tracked her down through fingerprint evidence recovered from a recently unearthed document in a Florence museum's storage archive. It was an old shipping manifest detailing the clandestine movement of stolen Renaissance paintings following a high-profile gallery heist. One of the prints had matched her old alias, Celestina Archer. Cross-referencing art records, customs logs, and surveillance photos from the 1980s led them to a Boston-based museum where a donated item showed identical penmanship to the manifest. That's when the pieces began to fall into place. From there, they quietly observed her movements for 6 months before confirming her identity. In the basement safe, the FBI discovered a passport under the name Serena Villette, dated from the early 80s. There were foreign currency bundles, euros, francs, and lira, all untraceable, along with a small collection of faded photographs. One showed her with 2 men standing in front of a private plane. Another showed her at what appeared to be a gala, dressed in red, holding a champagne glass. Each photograph was like a piece of a puzzle Harland never knew existed. More alarming than the photos, however, were the blueprints, floor plans of European museums marked with symbols and notes. The agents spread them out on the dining table like an archaeological dig site. Harland couldn't make sense of any of it. He had spent every year since 1985 with this woman. How could she be the same person they were describing? A missing figure in one of the most baffling art theft cases in European history. It didn't seem real, but the evidence piled higher. They even showed him records of a fake death certificate filed under the name Celestina Archer in 1984, supposedly to avoid further pursuit by Italian investigators. They said she disappeared shortly after the theft, around the same time a museum guard was found dead under suspicious circumstances. That was when she had reinvented herself and eventually met Harland. The agents didn't handcuff her right away. They treated her more like a high-level suspect than a violent criminal, knowing she wasn't a flight risk anymore. She was older, slower, and had lived in the open for decades. But that didn't lessen the severity of the case. She was escorted out of the home quietly, with her head held high and her hands steady at her sides. Harland followed her to the door, numb with disbelief. He didn't know what to say. His entire life had been constructed around a person who, as it turned out, might have never existed at all. After she was gone, Agent Montrose approached Harland and asked if he had any idea who his wife truly was. Harland said no. He wasn't even sure if Celestina Greaves had ever been real. All he knew was the woman who made lemon tea on cold nights, who laughed at corny crime dramas, who held his hand when they lost their first dog, and who had now vanished into federal custody with a past darker and more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The perfect life he thought he had built was shattered, replaced by a maze of secrets that left only questions and silence behind. In the days following Celestina's arrest, Harland found himself lost inside his own home. Every room felt unfamiliar, each corner steeped in quiet betrayal. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the hallway. Her favorite mug sat beside the kitchen sink, and her garden gloves were still draped over the porch railing, yet none of it felt real anymore. The FBI had taken copies of every document, photographed every inch of their house, and boxed up anything connected to her hidden life. Harland was left in the echo of a life that was never truly his. News of the arrest spread quickly. Ashridge Hollow was a small town, and word travelled fast when federal agents showed up at a beloved couple's home. Neighbours whispered. Some were stunned, others skeptical. Many couldn't reconcile the kind, gentle woman they knew with the criminal profile emerging in the media. Harland couldn't either. He watched the evening news with a blank stare as talking heads speculated on her past, splashing photos of the stolen art pieces across the screen. The headlines were brutal. Fugitive art thief discovered living quietly in suburban town. Missing heiress of international heist. Finally found. And the lady behind the frame. Celestina Greaves, unmasked. Harland received a call from a federal liaison the following week, informing him that Celestina had agreed to speak with investigators. They invited him to attend a preliminary debriefing. Despite the turmoil inside him, he said yes. He needed answers, not for closure, but for clarity. Some explanation that might make sense of the decades they had shared. When he arrived at the federal holding facility, he was ushered into a plain room with a metal table and a large one-way mirror. He waited in silence until the door opened and Agent Montrose entered, carrying a thin manila folder. She explained that Celestina had admitted to assuming multiple identities over the years, beginning as early as 1977. Her real name, they now believed, was Lyra Marceline. She had been born in southern France and raised in various cities across Europe. As a teenager, she had shown extraordinary intelligence and an affinity for art history, which led her to a shadowy group of elite thieves who targeted private collectors and undersecured galleries. According to Agent Montrose, Lyra had served as both a strategist and forger, helping swap originals with replicas so well crafted they went unnoticed for decades. She'd left that world behind following a disastrous heist in Milan, where one of the team members, a close friend, was killed in what officials now believed was a staged accident to cover up internal betrayal. Lyra, devastated and disillusioned, faked her own death and disappeared. She travelled under false documents, eventually reaching the US and reinventing herself as Celestina Archer. It was during that time that she met Harland at a charity art gala in Boston. The name Greaves came later, after their wedding. Harland sat motionless as the story unfolded. He could barely process it. His wife, the woman who once cried while reading Jane Austen aloud, who insisted on slow dancing in the kitchen when it rained, had once been part of an international art crime syndicate, and she'd walked away from that world without ever telling him, without ever slipping up in 4 decades of marriage. No late-night confessions, no outbursts, just silence. Montrose told Harland that Celestina's cooperation might spare her a long sentence. She had provided the names of former associates, many of whom were still being investigated. Some had died, some had vanished. But her knowledge was invaluable, and that made her a bargaining chip. Still, federal prosecutors were pursuing charges related to conspiracy, forgery, fraud, and possibly manslaughter, depending on new findings in the Milan case. That night, Harland returned home and walked into the basement. It no longer felt like an archive room, but a crypt, a chamber of secrets. He stared at the empty safe and the dust outlines of boxes removed by agents. The truth lay heavy on his shoulders. The woman he had loved, the life they had shared, it had all been real in feeling, but false in origin. Harland wondered whether he had been chosen because he was ordinary, safe, predictable, a man with a quiet life who asked few questions, a perfect cover. The thought twisted in his gut like a knife. But more painful than the betrayal was the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Celestina had loved him too, that her choice to stay all those years hadn't only been about hiding. It was a question he feared would never be answered. The trial date was set for late spring, and by then, the nation had developed a fascination with the woman they now called the Ghost of Milan. Reporters camped outside the courthouse each morning, eager for a glimpse of the elegant, silver-haired woman in the navy blue suit and pearl earrings. Celestina, or Lyra Marcelin as the prosecution insisted on calling her, never flinched under the camera flashes. She carried herself with grace, eyes steady, posture firm, lips closed. Harland watched it all unfold from the gallery, still unsure what emotion dominated him: grief, confusion, anger, or a strange, reluctant admiration. The prosecutors presented a carefully built timeline, stitching together scattered fragments of her past. They showed the jury pieces of evidence that spanned decades and continents. Letters in French signed LM, customs documents linked to stolen artwork, financial records pointing to offshore accounts, and grainy photographs from the 1980s. They traced her movements from Florence to Prague, then to Montreal, and finally Boston. The portrait was that of a mastermind who slipped through the cracks of international law, disappearing only to re-emerge as a perfect American housewife. Harland listened in silence, recalling little things she had done over the years, how she was always the one to avoid photos at events, how she never let anyone help her sort the mail, how she claimed to have no living relatives. It all made sense now, like scattered puzzle pieces falling into place. What struck him most, though, was how well she'd lived this second life. She had volunteered at libraries, donated to local schools, helped organize town parades. She wasn't a recluse or a hermit. She had inserted herself into the very fabric of their small community, and no one had suspected a thing. The defense leaned on her transformation. They argued that Lyra Marcelin no longer existed, that she had died in spirit and identity decades ago. They called Harland to the stand, asking him to describe the woman he had known. He did so honestly, recounting their holidays, their habits, and the simple joys they shared. The courtroom listened as he described their shared mornings in the garden, her obsession with crossword puzzles, and how she used to hum classical music while cooking. He ended his testimony by admitting he felt he had known her soul, even if he hadn't known her past. The prosecution countered by bringing in a retired Interpol agent who had spent years tracking Lyra in Europe. He described her as brilliant, but dangerous, capable of deception so intricate it took decades to unravel. His testimony painted her not as a reformed soul, but as a woman who had simply gone dormant, waiting for time to erase the past. He reminded the jury that a man had died during the Milan heist, and that no amount of peaceful years could bring back the life lost or the treasures stolen. As the trial continued, Harland received letters from Celestina. They were brief, handwritten, in tidy cursive. She never once asked for forgiveness. Instead, she wrote about memories, her favorite day from their honeymoon, a trip they took to Maine in the fall, the day they adopted their dog, Ludo. She ended each letter the same way. "Thank you for giving me something I never thought I deserved. Peace." Harland didn't reply. He kept the letters in a shoebox beneath the bed, unable to part with them, but unwilling to acknowledge them openly. Each letter reminded him of the life they built, and how fragile it all had been. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Celestina's greatest deception wasn't in the lies she told, but in how seamlessly she had blended truth with fiction. She hadn't just faked a life, she had lived one fully, all while hiding in plain sight. When closing arguments were made, the courtroom was silent. The jury deliberated for only 3 days before returning with a verdict. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and identity falsification. The manslaughter charge was dismissed due to insufficient evidence, but the remaining convictions meant she would serve a significant sentence. Celestina remained calm as the verdict was read, showing no tears, no outrage, just a soft nod. Harland left the courthouse alone. Reporters shouted questions, but he ignored them. There were no easy answers, no satisfying closure, only the truth that he had loved a stranger, and that the stranger had loved him back in the only way she knew how. Months passed. The whirlwind of the trial faded from headlines. The reporters packed up, and the town of Ashridge Hollow settled back into its usual rhythm. But for Harland Greaves, life no longer followed the comfortable patterns he once knew. The world felt quieter now, but also heavier, like it held its breath in the wake of a secret finally exposed. Celestina was transferred to a federal facility in upstate New York to begin serving her 25-year sentence. Harland visited once, unsure of what he hoped to gain. He sat across from her in a cold room divided by thick glass and spoke through a phone receiver. She looked older than he remembered, though only months had passed. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the phone, but her eyes remained clear. She asked about the house, the garden, Ludo. He answered simply. When she spoke of their years together, she did so with a quiet reverence, as if each memory was a fragile treasure. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "You were the only truth in my entire life." That was the last time he saw her. Back home, Harland considered selling the house. Every corner of it was layered in memory, and now those memories felt tainted by hidden shadows. But he stayed. Perhaps it was out of habit, or maybe a deeper sense of defiance. If she had spent 40 years making that place feel like home, then it had been real to her too, despite the secrets. So he repainted the kitchen, gave away the furniture she had picked out, and began restoring the garden she once loved. In the process, he found a strange kind of healing. The FBI eventually returned some of the personal belongings taken during the investigation. Among them was a small, hand-carved wooden box that Harland had never seen before. Inside were mementos Celestina had kept hidden, an old photograph of them on their wedding day, pressed flowers from a trip to the coast, a letter she had written but never sent. It was dated nearly 15 years ago. In it, she confessed everything: her past, her guilt, her love for him, and her fear that revealing the truth would destroy everything they had built. She ended the letter by saying that she knew the day might come when the past would catch up to her. She only hoped he would remember her not for the life she fled from, but for the one she chose to live with him. Reading it broke something in Harland, and then mended something else. The betrayal still hurt. The lies still burned. But for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe what they had wasn't entirely a fabrication. Maybe it was a collision of two worlds, one dark and buried, the other peaceful and real. And in that collision, something genuine had taken root. Years went by. Harland aged quietly, becoming a fixture in the town again. He joined the historical society, took up photography, and taught a class on gardening at the local community centre. People stopped asking about Celestina. New neighbours moved in, unaware of the infamous woman who had once lived behind the ivy-covered fence. Life continued, slowly but steadily. One winter morning, Harland received a letter from the prison. It was not from Celestina, but from the warden, informing him that she had passed away in her sleep due to complications from an undiagnosed illness. She had served nearly 9 years of her sentence. Her final request had been for her ashes to be scattered in their garden, if Harland allowed it. He said yes without hesitation. He stood alone in the garden on a foggy spring morning, the urn in his hands, the cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom. As he released her ashes into the wind, he thought of all the versions of the woman he had loved. The mysterious girl from Europe, the brilliant thief, the devoted wife, the gardener, the woman who kept a part of herself hidden for reasons he would never fully understand. Harland knew he would never have all the answers, but he had loved her, and perhaps, in her own way, she had loved him too. That, he decided, was enough.